One at a time. Like they said, they both say mid-20s, kind of light blonde hair, light brown hair. We had him on deck. Look like
Once again, it's your host, Gabe Morales. It's Blue Friday here in Hawaii. I'm wearing my Seahawks Hawaiian Aloha shirt because we did a miracle. I don't know, I don't know how we did it, but beat the Rams last night. It was probably one of the most exciting games that I've ever seen. Not good for my blood pressure, but it was a great game. So always a Seahawks fan. Today we have a very special guest. He is very knowledgeable in the field of criminal justice, in particular of corrections. We have Dan Pacholke here. He is going to talk a little bit about his life and career. How you doing this morning, sir? Aloha.
Aloha. I'm doing very well, Gabe, and I enjoyed the Seahawks game last night myself. So thanks for inviting me.
Oh, you're welcome. So I'm looking forward to this. Dan, can you tell us where were you born and raised?
Well, I was the son of a career Marine. So I was born in Iowa, and I would say I grew up in Southern California, down in Oceanside. California is where I grew up, but I lived in the Midwest. I lived in, the East Coast in North Carolina. I lived in Long Beach, California, a couple trips through Washington, three trips through California. I think I went 9 schools, K through 12. So my dad was career Marine, moved all over the place.
Gotcha. And so then when you were growing up in any of these places, were you aware of any gangs in the area?
Well, in Southern California, I would certainly say there were groupings of people that you didn't just go up and push your way into, right? I tended to do okay. I mean, I was a surfer as a kid, and I had black hair and a much darker brown shade than I am today. But I did okay. But there were stabbings and robbings at my high school, and knife fights, and I think everything that would indicate there were gangs there. But I was able to weave my way around it, I guess, because I lived on a military base.
Gotcha. And what did you do after high school?
Well, when I was in high school, when I was 18 years old, I went to work at Georgia Pacific, which was a corrugation mill. They made cardboard labor work at the time, but it was really like a family wage job. So I went in there in my senior year in high school and worked there for 3 years, just doing labor work behind machines.
And what made you decide to get into the field of corrections and criminal justice?
Well, to be honest with you, after just over 3 years or so working at that mill, and I was young, 19, 20 years old, and feeding these machines and making money, and I felt pretty good about myself. And I was looking over and seeing guys that were more than twice my age that had 25-year watches on their wrists that looked like they were going to pass out about half the time because the work was really hard. So I decided I can't do this all my life. I mean, it was fun, it was a great experience, but I needed something that had more of a future and had more longevity to it. So at the time, my dad by then was retired from the Marines, and he was a lieutenant on McNeil Island, and away I go. I go in and tour it once. Kind of scared me a little bit, but it was the contrast between like very normalized activities and a crisis in a minute that kind of attracted me. So I got into it just by looking for something new and different.
Got you. So you started off as a CO at McNeil Island, and then I understand that you worked at some other places. And at that time, was McNeil Island still under the feds, or was it under Washington DOC?
No, McNeil Island was under Washington DOC, but we had, in '79, you had big problems in Walla Walla with a riot and some crowding issues, and Monroe in about 1980 had a problem, and they also had a consent decree on some double selling issues. So McNeil Island was one of the interventions they used in order to bleed off overcrowding from both the penitentiary and Monroe. And so, here we go. I mean, it opens up at the time. So from there, and really my whole career was kind of marked by that in some ways. It's not long after that the prison system is looking at ways to continue to forecast the population and reduce crowding. So I went from McNeil Island to the Correction Center in Shelton as a sergeant. I'm sitting there one night on a Saturday, and Clallam Bay Correction Center up on the Olympic Peninsula, bordering a rainforest, is being opened. And I was recruited once again, kind of on expansion. We're building new prisons. So, I went to Clallam Bay as a lieutenant and was there as a captain until about 95. Promoted into headquarters to be the new chief of emergency operations, first chief of emergency operations. And that really was my lessons around how difficult it can be to move stuff at a headquarters level, but had a lot of fun in that. From that, I was the head of staff training for a while. I was the superintendent of Cedar Creek, Stafford Creek, interim superintendent of Monroe, deputy director over Command A, all high security operations, all max security, director of prisons, deputy secretary of the department, ultimately for 6 months or so as the head of the department as well. And I don't want to keep going on this, but at the same time, I was doing that when I was coming up in the system. I was a contract consultant for the National Institute of Corrections, which really was formed as an intention to be like Quantico for corrections. I was one of the first senior instructors with Defense Technology Corporation, which was doing work around emergency operations in jails and prisons. And lastly, I did consulting work for New York University in prisons and jails around the country. So just have, a lot of varied experience, 6 prisons in Washington. I've probably been to more than half the states in this nation. And I've also done consulting work in Santa Marta Penitentiary in Mexico City and Pentonville in London and Saipan and Guam, toured every prison in Alaska. So I've been around a little bit, saw a few things.
Yeah, it sounds like it, man. What a ride, man. Dan, so you started off as a corrections officer. A lot of times I have comments on my shows from corrections officers, occasionally from administrators. A lot of times administrators do that in private. They're a little bit more guarded with their questions and answers. But it is, I think you agree, a lot different working as a corrections officer as an administrator. And one of the goals of this show is to try to bridge that gap of understanding between the line staff and the administrators. Before we came on the air, we talked about the California system right now. It seems to me like the gap is widened down there, while in Washington, D.C., it seems like the gap is closed a little bit as far as understanding between the correction officer working the front lines and the administrators being down in headquarters or administration offices of institutions. What would you say is you saw some of the big differences in those roles?
Well, I think correctional officers, on the one hand, is they want to see administrators and they want to feel like you're down there with them in some ways on Christmas Eve, on a weekend, late at night when they have a problem, whether it's a disturbance or a flood or whatever the case may be. So one, I think you need to associate with them because oftentimes they will bring profound perspectives, to what can be changed on their post or given assignment. The downside of it sometimes is you're about as good as the last inning played. I mean, for a lot of correctional officers, the last, serious assault they saw, the last serious staff assault they've seen, the last really bad incident, it carries with them, even though, at the aggregate, you could show them over time, actually violence levels are lower. It's hard to get that across to them because they live in that, daily reality. I think for the best of administrators, they try and bridge like emerging standards of decency that kind of change over time based on research to integrate that into operations and continue to move the department forward. The ability to communicate that on a regular basis down to correctional officers is just difficult to do. I mean, correctional officers want to see their work in a strategic plan. A lot of it is just bridging those distances because correctional officers are out there in the reality of it every day, every minute of every day, and they can have profound observations. Oftentimes right, sometimes not, but they don't necessarily have the I suppose, the perspective of top administrators that are good at what they do in the sense of learning from what other systems do, learning from evidence-based practices, learning from the adaptation of other practices, learning what humanity can mean in a prison. So sometimes articulating that and sharing that with officers can be difficult, but absolutely, if you talk to enough of them, they are profound. They will change the way that you view the business.
Well, thank you for that perspective. I've been a line staff myself, a supervisor, and I can remember some really good supervisors, some really bad supervisors, some really good administrators, and really bad ones. And it sounds like what you're saying is administrators, some of them believe that, they should be heard, not seen. They don't ever walk the tiers. They don't ever go out in the units and hear the problems that officers are dealing with. It for some reason it's things are supposed to go up the chain of command and it never hits them. And they can actually hear from the officers themselves what they're dealing with, the problems, and see. Also, administrating by email. I saw a lot of administrators do that. Instead of talking to people, active listening skills, by them. They want the officers to change their thinking and have active listening skills with offenders, but yet the administrators sometimes don't want to do that same type of listening skills.
No, I mean, I think that's so true, Gabe. I'm going to give you two examples, and these are things that happened to me in the last few years. But I was touring a prison not too long ago and said, "Hey, I want to see, the mental health unit. I want to see the segregation unit." And the superintendent of that facility at the time said, "Oh no, no, I don't want to go down there. I'm going to go here to this tracks program." And to me, it's almost like a test. I mean, if you're a superintendent of a prison like that, and I'm touring, and I say I want to see these high security units, why would you not want to look at the most coercive units, perhaps the ones that have the most self-harm, use of force, bad things that happen? Why would you not want to go down there and look at that in order to problem solve? So sometimes they want to hide what they don't want to see, right? And they can fail those very tests just by an inability to do it. And it's really hard, I think, for correctional officers, unless you're willing to be out there with them, to have a sense that you understand this work. That even though you're an administrator, I mean, COs are on mandatory posts, working overtime, working bad days off, and they want to know you understand the reality of it. I don't know how you do it without spending enough time walking around. I just don't know how you would do it.
Well, I know they're very busy, but it sounds like you're saying some of them want to play the avoidance strategy. We call it hide in their office, and not deal with this. Put out a bunch of paper pushers is another thing that a lot of people call them, but not dealing with the real problems, head on. That may be not comfortable. Get out of their comfort zone.
I'm going to give you one more, and then I'm going to leave you alone here. But if you can get them behind it, it makes a huge difference. I was a lieutenant at Column Bay a long time ago, shift commander, and I'm standing there and I see the education director, and I go up and I said, "Hey, you've been offering, this is in the 80s, you're offering behavior management and verbal de-escalation to staff in the staff training academy." Yeah. He goes, "Yeah." He goes, I said, "Well, you just announced that you're going to offer it to inmates up on the education floor." He goes, "Yeah." I said, "Well, I just, third shift officers are kind of pissed about this." I said, now they feel like they're just going to get manipulated. And finally, after some discussion, he looks at me, he goes, "Look, Dan, I can take those 30 inmates up to the education floor between, 7 to 8:30 at night, and I can work with them in a classroom or not." So I go back to the officers and say, "Look, man, here's our choice. You want those 30 inmates in your unit between 7 and 8:30, or would you rather that guy takes them up in that classroom?" They say, "Oh, no, let's run the class." Because to them, it took pressure off their unit. To them, it reduced the amount of people they had to supervise. So the motivation there was, if you want to share the load on how to manage these people, oh yeah, we're in, let's do it. At first they thought it was manipulative, and then they just thought, well, as long as he's following orders, good enough with me, right? And so sometimes it's a matter of being able to relate it in a way that they can see it on their job.
We're going to have to stop right there for now, but we'll be back soon to continue our interesting conversation with corrections expert Dan Pacholke.